All right, we're going to talk today about climate and biomes. If I can figure out how to type that. All right, so climate and biomes. So when we talk about this, the climate is determined by how much sun a location gets, the rotation of the Earth, so that will influence a great deal of the weather that you get and therefore the climate, how air and water move, the kinds of gases in the atmosphere, and we won't spend a ton of time talking about it, but it's always good to have in the back of your mind that all of this is going to be influenced and changed as the Earth warms, and that will change global weather patterns and therefore climate. And then features of the Earth's surface, such as mountains and lakes and any geographical changes can influence climate as well. So let's talk about the difference between weather and climate. Commonly, people use those terms to mean the same thing, but they do not mean the same thing. Weather is a short-term method, it meaning that you have temperature, precipitation. You can look at the weather for the week. And if your weather changes, so for example, if it snows in May, which it has been doing, and it's been very cold, you can say that you had cold weather this spring. However, if you have several cold weather springs in a row, then you might think that your climate is changing, and you might look to see why that's happening. But it would, because you're averaging those temperatures, you have to have many years of data to say that the climate is changing. So the amount of temperature and precipitation are going to be the factors that go into climate, and those will also be influenced by latitude, meaning how far away you are from the equator, and the elevation, so how far you are from sea level, will determine those factors for you. So there are lots of different things that go into that. So looking here, you can see this is a map of the Earth, and you can see that you have a bunch of different temperature zones. So you have polar, where you have ice all the time. You have subarctic, where you have snow. You have places where you have cool temperatures. You have highland areas, meaning that they're mountainous, which will also mean that they're probably cold. You have places where you have consistently warm temperature. You have places where you have consistently dry temperature, which may be very cold or may be very warm. And then you have tropical areas that you can see here in green. And you have upwelling zones, which are places that you find warm water rising in the ocean. So you can see those. That's a aquatic symbol. You also have here major currents, and these currents are blue if they are cold, and they are red if they are warm. Again, warm water is going to be less dense than cold water, and warm air is going to be less dense than cold air. So warm water is going to rise in a body of water, and warm air is going to rise in the atmosphere. And those are things that cause major weather patterns. All right, so we're going to start talking about air and air circulation. So you have different temperatures, and if you listen to the weather, these are called fronts. So they'll say there's a cold front moving in, meaning that that's a mass of cold air. Because it's cold, it will be more dense, and it can push warm air along because it is more dense. And where you have two different fronts come together, that's where you tend to have weather events like rain or thunderstorms or things like the exciting weather events. These are also going to be influenced by the rotation of the Earth. So as the Earth rotates, the air pretty much that moves the air as it goes. And then of course, if you run into, say, a mountain, that will distort that air movement. Generally speaking, there are 6 convection cells that we're going to talk about, and those cause general air circulation patterns that are pretty predictable throughout the world. So this is what a convection cycle looks like. So let's, I'm going to give you a second to write these things down, particularly this box here, which is very important. So it is a cycle, so it happens in a sort of wheel, if you will, but we're going to start in a low pressure area. So here you have hot air. It is, because it's hot, it causes evaporation. So if there is any water to evaporate, that will cause more evaporation to happen. Because it is hot, those molecules are moving faster and they are less dense, which means that is going to rise. As it rises up higher, it is going to cool because the atmosphere is cooler than the land, and that causes that the water can't stay in the atmosphere, it can't stay as a vapor, and so it condenses into clouds and then rain happens. So in this low pressure area, low pressure frequently causes rain. So because there is constantly more hot air coming up behind it, it is pushed to the side. So now it's cooler, it's dry because it lost all of its moisture, and it's going to fall. And because it is cool, that makes it more dense. And so it falls down, and it is now sort of warmer. As it gets down, it becomes warmer. It's compressed, and so now you have sort of warm, dry air. And so a day where you have sort of cool, dry air is a high pressure day, that you would think of as a high pressure day. And if you have a barometer, that is what you would find. And then again, the cycle will continue. So as more air is moving up here and air is coming down here, it pushes air across the surface, and that causes wind. So looking at the Earth, it causes these are the convection cells. So we're going to start at the equator. Understand that at the equator gets the most consistent sunlight all the time. And so as sun beats down on the equator, you have, this is sort of a deceiving Earth picture because there's no water on it. There's a great deal of water at the equator. Let's just, don't freak out, just understand. See, here's the equator. See how much water there is at the equator. There's a lot of water at the equator. So as you are here, you have warm air. It's a very warm, the warmest air that, statistically that there's going to be on average. And so warm air is going to come up, rise up at the equator, and then it is going to keep being pushed up by more warm air behind it. As it gets up, it's going to cool and become more dense. It gets pushed out of the way. You have condensation and you have raining. And so you have these tropical rainforests and tropical deciduous forests that happen along the equator. So let's go back to our map, and you say here's the equator, and you can see all of this tropical land between the Tropic of Cancer and the Tropic of Capricorn. Hence, we call them the tropics. There are other areas here as well. You can see that there's some dry areas, and we're going to find out why that is in a minute. And there are also a variety of different. You can see that whereas there's mountainous regions here, you have highlands which have their own climate. So it's not universal, but it is pretty predictive. So hot air comes up, pushes. Now it's going to condense and get colder. It's going to fall. And some of that air is going to go back towards the equator, and some of it's going to fall and go north and south. And you now have, as it gets down, you're now at the bottom of that convection cell. We're going to go back to this last slide. So this process happens again. So you have warm, dry air. It's going to pick up some moisture. And it is going to cause a second convection cell both here and here. So it falls here. As it rises, it causes more wet areas. So now you have temperate deciduous forests. That's where we live. Well, we kind of live on the border between evergreen coniferous forests and temperate deciduous forests. And the reason that those forests can exist is because it's very wet. And the same thing happens in the southern hemisphere. Note, at the place where that air is coming down, it's very dry because it's dry air coming down all the time. And you have desert areas. And so let's go back to our world map. And you can see that these convection cycles happen and that the air comes down at those tropics, the Tropic of Cancer and the Tropic of Capricorn. And you do tend to find, look at all the swath of desert here and across the middle of Australia. So a lot of deserts happen on those tropics. And those happen at 30 degrees latitude in 30 degrees north and 30 degrees south. Because the Earth spins, this air doesn't come down, it doesn't come down in a stationary way, it comes down in a diagonal because the Earth is spinning, adding a little bit more complication to it. And so it ends up with, that's how you get trade winds. So it's convection cycles, and the rotation of the Earth causes these trade winds. And the one that we are most affected by here in the Northeast are the westerlies that go from the south, like by Florida, of the south of the East Coast to the north of the East Coast, and it runs up the East Coast. And so those are the westerlies, and they are pretty consistent prevailing winds. All right. So something even more complex happens with ocean currents. Again, warm air is going to rise, and warm water is also going to rise. Cold water is going to be more dense, and it is going to sink. And there are places where it is predictable where the water is warmer and where the water is less warm. And these currents affect a lot of what can live in a particular area. And it also affects the climate on the land that is near it. So it redistributes heat. It mixes ocean waters, which is very important to ocean life. And if you find this very interesting, I teach a class called Ocean Science, where you can learn about what lives where in the ocean and why. And it distributes nutrients and oxygen. Oxygen is there's more oxygen in cold water than there is in warm water. That's an important thing for the life that lives there. So global currents are loops. They move energy through the globe, and they're very important for the economy of shipping, which moves goods from one place to another. If you remember in Finding Nemo, how they catch the current, and that makes them move very quickly. Boats also work on catching that current. And so the ocean really affects the climates in particular areas. So generally speaking, there's this convection belt that causes, so you have warm water, and it generally speaking starts around the equator, and it moves in these sort of what they call the conveyor belt. And as it gets up towards the northern part of the hemisphere, of the North Hemisphere, it gets cold and it sinks, and then you end up having colder currents, and this really affects the climate. So if you live in New Hampshire, which is right about here, it is, now I can't really see it, it's about the same as like Spain, and Spain is quite warm. And New Hampshire can be quite cold, and we have much harsher winters. And they don't, because they have much warmer ocean currents, and ocean, like everything coming off the ocean is warm for them. Where if you've ever taken a swim out in the Atlantic, I don't think you can ever say it's warm. And if you do say it's warm, you're a New Englander who's talking relatively. So as that, and then that cold convection moves, and then it splits down here to about Antarctica. It goes back up towards Africa and Asia, and it keeps going down below Australia. And then as it gets up towards the equator, it does heat up, and then it sort of loops back. There is an idea that these conveyor belts, if you will change with global warming, and that could be very catastrophic for both industry and for the marine life and the general ecosystems of places that are affected. So pretty much everything that is coastal is affected by these currents. All right, so other features of the Earth. So heat is going to move in and out of atmospheres much quicker on land. Water is going to make an area more temperate. So if you live at the ocean, you get less snow. Like they get less snow in Hampton than you get more inland. So as you move more inland, you get more snow further from the coast. Because the ocean moderates that climate. So a lot of their precipitation comes down in rain, even just here. And then there is water or air that comes off the ocean is generally speaking going to be very wet because there's so much water to be absorbed there. And then mountains can block that. So oftentimes on a coastal mountain range, you will find that you have a very sort of wet tropical climate on the ocean side, and then on the far side of those oceans, you have what's called a rain shadow. And on the far side of that mountain, or the leeward side of that mountain, you end up with a very dry climate. So let's look at an example of that. So this is a good example of the West Coast. So on the West Coast, you have wet air coming in off the ocean. As it rises up, it's going to precipitate. You're going to lose a lot of that moisture on the ocean side of the mountains. And then when it returns to the other side of the mountains, it's going to be very, very dry. And it's going to be hot. But there isn't going to be any precipitation, so you tend to have this rain shadow effect where you end up having deserts on the other side of mountains. So you'll have really tropical weather on climate on one side and very dry climate on the other. All right, so let's talk about biomes, because that's what we're going to talk about for the next couple of weeks. A biome is defined as a large region of the Earth, so not like a tiny pocket, but a large region that has a certain climate and certain types of dominant plant and animal communities. So it is very specific. So if you drop someone in the middle of a tropical rainforest based on how they feel and what they see around them, if they know what they're talking about, they should be able to say, I'm in a tropical rainforest. So things that make one biome different than another is the amount of precipitation, the annual temperature, and that's going to make tropical places temperate places, which means that they are sort of moderate in temperature, but the temperature does fluctuate, as opposed to tropical areas where it, generally speaking, does not. Cold deserts and hot deserts, grasslands, forests, and there are different kinds there are deciduous forests and coniferous forests, and all of their locations are, generally speaking, determined by geography, their proximity to water, and the amount and their altitude, their altitude, their longitude, and their latitude. So, generally speaking, you have different communities within a biome, but the whole biome is going to be sort of have a general feel to it. So tropical, like you can have different biomes or communities within a tropical biome, but it will be distinctly a tropical biome throughout, and that's because it has the same amount of temperature and precipitation. So it depends on how you classify it. You can have more, and these are all listed here are all terrestrial or land biomes. There are also aquatic biomes that are different as well, and so some of you might be researching those. So you have high mountain biomes, you have polar ice, you have tundra, you have temperate grasslands, which you can have across Eurasia and in the middle of the United States. Tropical grasslands, which are the savanna, so think Lion King. Chaparral, which is something that you can find just in California, but is sort of typified by old Western movies. They used to shoot a lot of movies in the chaparral, Western movies in the chaparral, and you also find some of that at the northern part of Africa and the southern part of Europe. Temperate deciduous forests, which is, we sort of live on the border between the temperate deciduous forest and the coniferous forest. Deciduous meaning that the trees lose their leaves. Coniferous forest meaning that they're conifers, and you can see that you have large, so pine trees, you have a large swath of that across Canada and Eurasia up here and Russia. Tropical rainforests, which you have a lot of in this sort of around the equator that we talked about before. Tropical dry forests, which you have in places that are around the tropics. And then full-on deserts where you have very little water, very little precipitation that you have at, again, at those tropics. So other things that affect the climate are going to be latitude and elevation. As you move up, if you've ever done any hiking, as you move up in altitude, the weather becomes much harsher. And so you can, and it actually kind of mimics going up in elevation is kind of like going, let's see if we can find a good picture of this, like going up in latitude as well, and so it sort of mimics that. So you will start with, if you start at a tropical forest at the base of your mountain, you will, as you move up, you'll find that you get deciduous forests, then you'll have conifers, and you'll always find you have pine trees closer to the top, and then you have tundra-like organisms, lichens, herbs, little mosses, little scrub brushes, and then you have places where no plants can live as you get higher up in elevation. So you see the same thing as you move out in latitude, so I guess I could just have showed you this, but this is, you start out with tropical forests, then as you move further away from the equator, which is what they're showing you here, you would have deciduous forests. Those turn into coniferous forests as you move further north, and as you get into places where you have permafrost, you can no longer have trees because they can't root themselves properly, so you end up with herbs, little scrubs, lichen, mosses, grasses, and then you end up with polar ice and snow where nothing can live. So if you look at it, I like this is kind of a nice graphic where you have temperature. So as temperature decreases, as you imagine you move away from the equator, you have decreasing temperature. And as you move away, you have decreasing precipitation. So, but you're still in this hot zone. In this hot zone, you can have tropical rainforests, you can have tropical seasonal forests, you can have scrubland and savannas, and then you end up with deserts. In the temperate zones, there are two different kinds of temperate zones. There's like kind of warmish temperate zones and colder temperate zones. You would have deciduous forests and chaparrals, grasslands, and deserts as you get less and less moisture. Big coniferous forests, and moving into subpolar sort of scrub area that you would find where you have permafrost. And then in the cold area, you have essentially tundra, where you do have permafrost all the time. So you'll use this information, you will take notes on this, and you will submit it in the assignment, and that is due on Wednesday.